In 1857, the household of Margaret Whitmore stood as a testament to Southern prosperity in Marlborough County, South Carolina. The two-story plantation home, with its white columns and wraparound porch, overlooked cotton fields that stretched toward the PD River. What appeared to be a model of antebellum elegance would become the center of one of the most chilling revelations in the documented history of American slavery. Margaret Whitmore, 34 years old, had inherited the plantation from her late husband 3 years prior. Known throughout the county for her refined manners and charitable contributions to the local Methodist Church, she maintained a household staff of 7 enslaved individuals. Among them was a young woman named Delilah Hayes, 22 years old, whose intelligence and composure had earned her the position of personal attendant to Mrs. Whitmore. The first indication that something was amiss came from an unlikely source. Reverend Thomas Caldwell of the Marlborough Methodist Church recorded in his personal journal an observation that would later prove significant. During his monthly visits to bless the Whitmore household, he noted that Delilah Hayes possessed an unusual habit. She would arrange flowers in the parlor using a pattern that seemed deliberate yet inexplicable. The stems were always positioned in groups of 3, 5, and 7. When questioned about this arrangement, Delilah would simply state that it pleased Mrs. Whitmore. What Reverend Caldwell could not have known was that Delilah Hayes had developed a system of communication that would expose one of the most carefully guarded secrets in Marlborough County. Through years of careful observation and remarkable ingenuity, she had created a method of recording information that her mistress believed would remain forever hidden. The Whitmore plantation operated under a facade of typical Southern hospitality. Mrs. Whitmore entertained frequently, hosting dinner parties for the local gentry and contributing generously to church functions. Her guests often commented on the exceptional training of her household staff, particularly praising the quiet efficiency with which Delilah Hayes managed the domestic arrangements. What they did not observe were the subtle patterns that Delilah incorporated into every aspect of her daily tasks. The flower arrangements were merely one component of an elaborate system. Delilah would fold linens in specific configurations, arrange books on shelves according to a code only she understood, and position furniture with minute adjustments that appeared accidental but followed a deliberate pattern. Each adjustment, each arrangement, each seemingly random act was part of a documentation process that would eventually reveal the truth about what occurred in the Whitmore house after the guests departed. Mrs. Whitmore's reputation in the community was beyond reproach. She was known for her gentle treatment of her enslaved workers, her generous donations to charitable causes, and her adherence to Christian principles. Local records from the Marlborough County Courthouse show that she had never been cited for any infractions related to the treatment of her property. The Methodist Church records indicate her regular attendance and substantial financial contributions. To all external observers, Margaret Whitmore embodied the ideals of Southern womanhood. However, Delilah Hayes observed a different version of her mistress. In the privacy of the plantation house, particularly during the long winter evenings when no guests were expected, Mrs. Whitmore's demeanor would undergo a transformation that Delilah began to document through her intricate system of environmental manipulation. The system Delilah developed required remarkable intelligence and memory. She assigned numerical values to different household objects and their positions. A book placed spine in represented one value, spine out another. Candles positioned at specific heights on their holders indicated different categories of information. Even the way she arranged Mrs. Whitmore's personal effects in her bedroom followed this coded system. Through this method, Delilah began to document a pattern of behavior that contradicted everything the community believed about Margaret Whitmore. The arrangements recorded instances of verbal abuse, physical intimidation, and psychological manipulation that occurred when no witnesses were present. More disturbing still, the coded arrangements began to document Mrs. Whitmore's interactions with other members of the household staff, revealing a systematic pattern of control and punishment that extended far beyond what was considered normal, even by the standards of the time. The breakthrough in understanding Delilah's system came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1858, Mrs. Whitmore's nephew, Jonathan Whitmore, arrived from Charleston to settle some family business matters. 26 years old and recently graduated from the College of Charleston, Jonathan possessed a keen interest in mathematics and patterns. During his 3-week stay, he began to notice the consistent arrangements throughout the house. Unlike the previous visitors who had attributed the precise organization to good training, Jonathan recognized the mathematical precision underlying Delilah's work. He observed that the arrangements changed daily, but followed underlying rules that suggested a systematic approach. His background in mathematics allowed him to see what others had missed. This was not random organization, but a sophisticated encoding system. Jonathan's initial curiosity led him to begin documenting the arrangements himself. He sketched the positions of various objects, noted the numerical patterns in flower arrangements, and tracked the changes from day to day. What he discovered was a level of complexity that indicated not only intelligence, but also a specific purpose behind the arrangements. The revelation of the system's meaning came through a tragedy that exposed the full extent of Mrs. Whitmore's hidden nature. In late May of 1858, an enslaved woman named Ruth Thompson, who worked in the kitchen, was found dead in her quarters. The official cause of death, recorded by Dr. Henry Morrison, was listed as heart failure. However, Delilah's arrangements in the days following Ruth's death told a different story. The positioning of objects throughout the house in the week after Ruth's death created a pattern that Jonathan began to decipher. Using his mathematical background, he started to understand that the arrangements corresponded to specific events and times. The flower groupings, the book positions, the candle heights, all were components of a temporal record that documented what had occurred in the Plantation house. What Jonathan discovered through interpreting Delilah's code was evidence that Ruth Thompson's death was not from natural causes. The arrangements indicated a confrontation between Mrs. Whitmore and Ruth over missing silver pieces from the dining room. According to the coded record, Mrs. Whitmore had accused Ruth of theft and subjected her to a punishment that resulted in her death. The arrangement suggested that Ruth had been locked in a root cellar beneath the kitchen for several days, without food or water. The sophistication of Delilah's system extended beyond simple documentation. She had created multiple layers of meaning within the arrangements, allowing her to record not only events, but also their context and consequences. The positioning of Mrs. Whitmore's personal Bible on her nightstand, for example, correlated with specific types of punishments inflicted on household staff. The angle at which curtains were drawn indicated the severity of Mrs. Whitmore's moods and the likelihood of violence. Jonathan's growing understanding of the system filled him with horror at what was being revealed. The coded arrangements documented years of abuse that had been carefully hidden from the outside world. They revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation, physical punishment, and systematic degradation that contradicted every aspect of Mrs. Whitmore's public persona. The decision to act on this information presented Jonathan with a moral and legal dilemma. In 1858 South Carolina, the testimony of enslaved individuals held no legal weight against white property owners. Even if Delilah could be convinced to testify about what she had witnessed, her words would carry no authority in any court of law. The coded arrangements, while ingenious, would be dismissed as the fantasy of an ignorant slave by any legal authority. However, Jonathan possessed something that gave weight to the accusations, his own witness to Mrs. Whitmore's character. During his stay, he had observed her treatment of the household staff when she believed herself unobserved. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the enslaved workers when Mrs. Whitmore entered a room. Most importantly, he had witnessed an incident that confirmed the accuracy of Delilah's coded records. On the evening of June 2nd, 1858, Jonathan observed Mrs. Whitmore's response to a minor accident in the dining room. Delilah had accidentally knocked over a water glass while serving dinner. Mrs. Whitmore's reaction was swift and violent. She struck Delilah across the face with sufficient force to knock her to the ground, then proceeded to deliver a verbal assault that revealed the hatred she harbored for the woman who served her daily. What made this incident particularly significant was that Jonathan was able to observe how Delilah documented the event through her arrangement system. The following morning, the positioning of objects throughout the house had changed in ways that corresponded to what Jonathan had witnessed. This confirmation of the system's accuracy gave him confidence in the other revelations it contained. The moral weight of the knowledge began to affect Jonathan's health and disposition. He found himself unable to sleep, haunted by the implications of what he had discovered. The arrangements revealed not just individual incidents of cruelty, but a systematic pattern of abuse that had been ongoing for years. They documented the deaths of at least 3 other enslaved individuals under circumstances that suggested they were not from natural causes. The coded arrangements also revealed something else that deeply disturbed Jonathan, evidence that Mrs. Whitmore was not acting alone. The system documented visits from other plantation owners in the area who participated in what could only be described as systematic torture sessions. The arrangements indicated that these gatherings occurred monthly, always when no legitimate guests were expected, and always resulted in severe consequences for members of the household staff. The names documented through Delilah's system included some of the most respected figures in Marlborough County society. Colonel William Harrison, Judge Robert Stackhouse, and Dr. Henry Morrison were among those whose participation in these gatherings was recorded through the coded arrangements. The revelation that the very officials responsible for maintaining law and order were participants in these activities explained why such systematic abuse could continue undetected. Jonathan's investigation into the meaning of Delilah's arrangements had revealed not just individual cruelty, but an organized network of sadistic behavior among the county's elite. The sophistication of the cover-up, the official dismissal of deaths as natural causes, and the complete absence of any legal scrutiny suddenly made sense when viewed as part of a coordinated effort to protect the participants. The question of how to proceed with this knowledge tormented Jonathan. Direct confrontation with Mrs. Whitmore would accomplish nothing and would likely result in severe consequences for Delilah and the remaining household staff. Legal authorities were compromised by their own participation in the activities being documented. The social and political structure of the county made any conventional approach to justice impossible. During the final week of his stay, Jonathan made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Rather than attempting to work within a corrupted system, he chose to document everything he had learned with the intention of exposing the network through channels outside of Marlborough County. He began to create detailed records of Delilah's system, translating the coded arrangements into written accounts of the events they documented. Working secretly in his room during the early morning hours, Jonathan transcribed years of hidden history. The arrangements revealed systematic abuse that extended back to Mrs. Whitmore's marriage to her late husband. They documented the deaths of enslaved individuals whose disappearances had been attributed to running away. They provided evidence of a network of wealthy planters who gathered regularly to engage in activities that would shock even the most hardened observers. The sophistication of the abuse was matched by the sophistication of the cover-up. The arrangements documented how deaths were staged to appear natural, how bodies were disposed of, and how official records were falsified. They revealed the role played by Dr. Morrison in providing false death certificates and Judge Stackhouse in dismissing any inquiries that arose. The system exposed a level of corruption that extended to the highest levels of county government. On his final morning at the plantation, Jonathan made contact with Delilah to confirm his understanding of her system. The conversation took place in the early hours before dawn, in the kitchen while the rest of the household slept. What he learned from that brief exchange exceeded even his worst fears about what the arrangements had documented. Delilah confirmed that the coded system was indeed a record of events within the plantation house. However, she also revealed that it was only one part of a larger network of communication. Other enslaved individuals on plantations throughout the county had developed similar systems. The information was being shared and coordinated across multiple locations. What Jonathan had discovered was not just one woman's documentation of abuse, but part of an extensive intelligence network that had been operating in secret for years. The implications of this revelation were staggering. The enslaved population had developed their own system of investigation and documentation that operated completely outside the awareness of their owners. They had been collecting evidence, coordinating information, and building a comprehensive record of the crimes being committed against them. Delilah's flower arrangements were just one visible component of an underground information network that spanned the entire region. Jonathan's departure from the Whitmore plantation marked the beginning of a dangerous mission. He carried with him detailed transcriptions of Delilah's coded records, along with his own observations of the systematic abuse he had witnessed. His destination was Charleston, where he hoped to find authorities who were not part of the corrupted network he had discovered in Marlborough County. However, the reach of the network extended further than Jonathan had anticipated. Within days of his arrival in Charleston, he was contacted by individuals who somehow knew about his investigation. The message was clear. His inquiry into affairs in Marlborough County was unwelcome and potentially dangerous. The suggestion was made that he might be happier continuing his life in another state entirely. The threat was sufficient to convince Jonathan that direct action through legal channels was impossible. However, he refused to abandon the evidence he had gathered. Instead, he chose to document everything in a detailed account that he deposited with a trusted friend in Charleston, with instructions that it should be preserved and possibly published at some future date when conditions might allow for justice. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore plantation, Delilah continued to document events through her arrangement system. However, she also began to modify her approach in response to the knowledge that Jonathan had deciphered her code. The arrangements became more subtle, the patterns more complex. She had learned that her system could be understood by others, which opened new possibilities for communication. The summer of 1858 passed without incident at the plantation. Mrs. Whitmore continued to maintain her public facade of charitable Christian womanhood, while the household staff lived in terror of her private moments of rage. The monthly gatherings of county officials continued, and Delilah continued to document their activities through increasingly sophisticated arrangement patterns. The breakthrough came in September when Delilah made contact with an unexpected ally. Marcus Williams, a free black carpenter who worked occasionally on plantation maintenance projects, had observed the arrangement patterns during his visits to various properties. His own intelligence and education allowed him to recognize the systematic nature of what he was seeing. Unlike Jonathan, who had stumbled upon the code by accident, Marcus approached Delilah directly to inquire about the patterns. The relationship that developed between Delilah and Marcus created new possibilities for documenting and potentially exposing the network of abuse. Marcus had connections throughout the region that extended beyond the enslaved population. His status as a free person of color gave him access to communities and information sources that were unavailable to those held in bondage. Most importantly, he had connections with abolitionists in the North who might be able to act on the information being gathered. Through Marcus, Delilah's coded arrangements began to reach a wider audience. The information was transcribed and passed along through underground networks that eventually reached sympathetic ears in Philadelphia and Boston. The sophistication and detail of the documentation impressed even experienced abolitionists who had seen many accounts of plantation abuse. The systematic nature of the evidence and the revelation of an organized network of participants made this case unique in their experience. However, the process of exposing the network would prove more dangerous than anyone anticipated. In October of 1858, Marcus Williams disappeared while traveling between plantations on a routine work assignment. His body was found several days later in a remote area near the PD River. The official ruling was accidental death by drowning, but the circumstances suggested otherwise. The death of Marcus Williams sent a clear message to anyone who might be tempted to interfere with the established order in Marlborough County. However, it also had an unintended consequence. It motivated others to take action. The network of enslaved individuals who had been developing their own communication systems realized that passive documentation was no longer sufficient. The time had come for more direct action. The winter months of 1858 brought an increase in the sophistication and coordination of the underground information network. Delilah's arrangement system evolved to include new elements that allowed for more complex communication. The positioning of agricultural tools, the arrangement of kitchen implements, even the way clothing was hung out to dry began to carry coded meanings that could be read by those who understood the system. The information being shared through these networks revealed the full extent of the organized abuse taking place throughout the county. Multiple plantations were involved, dozens of officials were participants, and the systematic nature of the cover-up extended to banks, churches, and government offices. The enslaved population had documented evidence of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local society. The response from abolitionist networks in the North was swift, but necessarily secretive. Plans began to develop for a coordinated effort to expose the Marlborough County network. However, the dangerous fate of Marcus Williams demonstrated the risks involved in any direct action. The approach would need to be carefully planned and executed to avoid the same tragic consequences. The opportunity for action came from an unexpected source. In early 1859, a young journalist named William Patterson arrived in South Carolina to write a series of articles about plantation life for a Boston newspaper. Patterson's assignment was to document the daily routines and social structures of Southern agriculture. What he could not have anticipated was that he would become the key to exposing one of the most systematic conspiracies of abuse in American history. Patterson's initial approach to his assignment was conventional. He arranged visits to several plantations in the region, conducted interviews with owners and overseers, and observed field operations and household management. His early articles for the Boston Herald described the efficiency and organization of plantation agriculture with the detached objectivity expected of Northern journalism of the period. However, Patterson possessed qualities that made him more perceptive than the typical visitor to Southern plantations. His background included education in mathematics and natural sciences, which allowed him to recognize patterns that might escape other observers. More importantly, his journalistic training had taught him to look beyond surface appearances and to question official explanations of events. During his visit to the Whitmore Plantation in February of 1859, Patterson encountered Delilah's arrangement system. Unlike previous visitors who had dismissed the precise organization as evidence of good training, Patterson recognized the mathematical sophistication underlying the patterns. His subsequent investigation into the meaning of these arrangements would lead to the exposure of the entire network. The process by which Patterson deciphered Delilah's code required several weeks of careful observation and analysis. Working with the transcriptions that Jonathan Whitmore had left with his friend in Charleston, Patterson was able to understand the basic principles underlying the arrangement system. However, Delilah had continued to develop and refine the code in the months since Jonathan's departure, making the current arrangements more complex than what had been previously documented. The key breakthrough came when Patterson recognized that the arrangements were not just documenting individual events, but were creating a comprehensive historical record. Each day's patterns built upon previous arrangements to create an ongoing narrative that extended back for years. The sophistication of this historical documentation rivaled that of conventional written records and provided a level of detail that would have been impossible to achieve through any other means. What Patterson discovered through interpreting the arrangements was evidence of systematic murder, torture, and conspiracy that involved some of the most prominent citizens in South Carolina. The documentation revealed not just individual acts of cruelty, but an organized network that operated with the knowledge and protection of local authorities. The implications were so staggering that Patterson initially questioned whether he had correctly understood the coded information. Verification of the arrangement system's accuracy came through Patterson's observation of current events and their subsequent documentation in Delilah's patterns. When Mrs. Whitmore received news of a business setback in early March, her response included a violent outburst directed at the household staff. Patterson observed both the incident and the way it was subsequently coded into the arrangement patterns, confirming the system's reliability as a historical record. The decision of how to proceed with this information presented Patterson with both professional and moral challenges. The story had the potential to create a sensation that would advance his career significantly. However, the safety of the individuals who had provided the information was of paramount concern. Any premature or careless exposure could result in deadly consequences for those who had developed and maintained the coded systems. Patterson's solution was to develop a comprehensive strategy that would expose the network while providing protection for his sources. Working through abolitionist contacts in the North, he arranged for simultaneous publication of his findings in multiple newspapers across several states. The coordinated release would make it difficult for the conspirators to suppress the information or retaliate against specific individuals. The investigation required several more months to complete. Patterson extended his stay in South Carolina through the summer of 1859, gathering additional evidence and verifying the information contained in the coded arrangements. His work revealed that the Marlborough County network was part of a larger regional conspiracy that extended into North Carolina and Georgia. The sophistication of the cover-up was matched by the sophistication of the evidence that had been gathered against it. The enslaved population had documented not just the crimes themselves, but also the methods used to conceal them. They had recorded the falsification of death certificates, the bribery of officials, and the intimidation of potential witnesses. The documentation provided a complete picture of how such systematic abuse could continue undetected for years. The final phase of Patterson's investigation involved confirming the current status of the network's activities. In August of 1859, he was able to observe one of the monthly gatherings that Delilah had been documenting through her arrangements. Hidden in the woods surrounding the Whitmore plantation, Patterson witnessed events that confirmed the accuracy of the coded records and provided contemporary verification of the ongoing nature of the conspiracy. The publication of Patterson's exposé in September of 1859 created exactly the sensation he had anticipated. Newspapers across the North carried the story, and the evidence was sufficiently detailed to convince even skeptical readers. The sophisticated documentation provided by the coded arrangement systems gave the story a credibility that previous accounts of plantation abuse had often lacked. However, the response from South Carolina authorities was swift and predictable. Patterson was arrested on charges of trespassing and disturbing the peace. Mrs. Whitmore and the other implicated individuals denied all allegations and claimed that the coded arrangements were fantasies created by their enslaved workers to cause trouble. The official response was to dismiss the entire account as abolitionist propaganda designed to damage the reputation of the South. The legal proceedings that followed demonstrated the impossibility of achieving justice through conventional channels. Despite overwhelming evidence, no indictments were issued against any of the implicated individuals. The testimony of enslaved witnesses was ruled inadmissible, and Patterson's observations were dismissed as the biased reporting of a northern agitator. The case was closed within months, with no legal consequences for anyone involved in the conspiracy. However, the exposure had consequences that extended beyond the legal system. The detailed documentation of systematic abuse and the revelation of an organized conspiracy created a scandal that damaged the reputations of those involved. Several of the implicated individuals found their social and business relationships affected by the allegations. More importantly, the exposure disrupted the operations of the network and made it impossible for the activities to continue as they had before. The fate of those who had provided the evidence was mixed. Delilah Hayes and several other enslaved individuals disappeared from the Whitmore plantation shortly after the story was published. Official records indicate that they were sold to plantations in other states, but abolitionist networks suggest that they may have been assisted in escaping to freedom through underground railroad connections that had been established during the investigation. Mrs. Whitmore continued to live at the plantation until her death in 1862. However, her social position in the community never recovered from the allegations. The monthly gatherings ceased, and several of the implicated officials retired from their positions or moved to other regions. While legal justice was never achieved, the exposure succeeded in disrupting the network and ending its activities. The coded arrangement system developed by Delilah Hayes represents one of the most sophisticated examples of resistance and documentation in the history of American slavery. The mathematical precision and historical comprehensiveness of her work rival that of trained historians and journalists. Her ability to maintain such detailed records while living under conditions of constant surveillance and potential violence demonstrates remarkable courage and intelligence. The broader implications of the network of communication systems that had developed among the enslaved population of Marlborough County suggest that the historical record of plantation life may be incomplete in significant ways. The ability of enslaved individuals to document, coordinate, and preserve evidence of their experiences indicates that they possessed far greater agency and intellectual capacity than conventional historical narratives have acknowledged. The case also reveals the extent to which systematic abuse could be concealed through coordination among those in positions of authority. The involvement of judges, doctors, and other officials in both the commission and cover-up of crimes demonstrates how institutional corruption could make justice impossible to achieve through conventional legal channels. The conspiracy required not just individual cruelty, but systematic coordination among multiple levels of local government and society. The technical sophistication of Delilah's documentation system raises questions about what other evidence of historical events may have been preserved through unconventional means. The ability to encode complex information into seemingly mundane household arrangements suggests that important historical information may exist in forms that have not been recognized by traditional historical research methods. The courage demonstrated by those who participated in documenting and exposing the network serves as a reminder of the human capacity for resistance even under the most oppressive conditions. The willingness of individuals to risk their lives to preserve evidence of injustice and to seek accountability for systematic abuse represents one of the most admirable aspects of human nature when confronted with institutionalized evil. Years later, in 1867, during the period of Reconstruction, additional evidence of the Marlborough County network surfaced when federal investigators examined local records as part of broader efforts to understand the nature of slavery in South Carolina. The investigators found references to the coded arrangement systems in documents that had been preserved by abolitionist networks, providing additional confirmation of the events that Patterson had documented. However, by that time, most of the individuals involved in the conspiracy had died or moved away from the region. The opportunity for legal accountability had passed, and the focus of reconstruction efforts was on rebuilding rather than prosecuting past crimes. The case became a historical footnote rather than a source of justice for those who had suffered under the systematic abuse. The documentation provided by Delilah Hayes and the other enslaved individuals who participated in the information network was eventually deposited in archives maintained by abolitionist organizations in the North. These records provide one of the most detailed accounts of plantation life from the perspective of those who lived under its conditions. However, the coded nature of much of the information has made it difficult for historians to fully interpret and utilize in reconstructing the historical record. The legacy of the Marlborough County case extends beyond its immediate historical significance. It demonstrates the importance of recognizing alternative forms of documentation and resistance that may not conform to conventional historical sources. The sophistication of the enslaved population's response to their conditions challenges assumptions about literacy, intelligence, and agency that have influenced historical interpretations of the slavery period. The case also serves as a reminder of the institutional barriers that could prevent justice even when compelling evidence existed. The involvement of local authorities in both the commission and cover-up of crimes made conventional legal remedies impossible and required alternative approaches to exposure and accountability. This pattern has relevance for understanding other historical situations where systematic abuse has been protected by institutional corruption. The ingenuity demonstrated by Delilah Hayes in developing her coded arrangement system represents a remarkable example of intellectual creativity under extreme constraints. Her ability to create a comprehensive documentation system using only the materials and opportunities available within a plantation household demonstrates the human capacity for innovation and resistance even under the most restrictive conditions. In the end, the story of how a beautiful enslaved woman's seemingly stupid trick revealed the truth her mistress tried to hide serves as testimony to the power of human intelligence and courage in confronting systematic injustice. The coded arrangements that appeared to casual observers as evidence of good training were actually sophisticated historical documentation that preserved evidence of crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden forever. The silence that followed the exposure of the Marlborough County network was not the silence of resolution, but the silence of a society that was not ready to confront the full implications of what had been revealed. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was sophisticated, and the courage of those who provided it was remarkable. However, the institutional structures that had protected the systematic abuse remained in place, making meaningful accountability impossible to achieve. Today, the documents preserved from Delilah Hayes's coded arrangement system remain in archives maintained by historical societies in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. Researchers continue to work on fully interpreting the mathematical patterns that encoded years of hidden history. Each new understanding of her system reveals additional details about life under slavery that challenge conventional historical narratives and provide insight into the experiences of those whose voices were systematically excluded from official records. The truth that emerged from those carefully arranged flowers, precisely positioned books, and deliberately angled candles was that systematic evil could be documented, exposed, and disrupted even when conventional channels of justice were corrupted or unavailable. The courage and intelligence demonstrated by those who developed and maintained these documentation systems serve as a reminder that the human spirit's capacity for resistance cannot be eliminated even under the most oppressive conditions. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all, that such sophisticated systems of documentation and resistance were necessary, that the institutional protections that should have prevented such systematic abuse were instead part of the conspiracy to conceal it, and that justice could only be achieved through the extraordinary courage and intelligence of those who had the most to lose by speaking the truth. The echoes of those coded arrangements continue to resonate through American history, reminding us that the official record may not tell the complete story, that those who appeared powerless may have possessed forms of agency and resistance that have not been fully recognized, and that the pursuit of justice sometimes requires methods and courage that go far beyond conventional legal and social channels. The silence that followed the exposure of the Marlborough County network was not the silence of resolution, but the silence of a society that was not ready to confront the full implications of what had been revealed. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was sophisticated, and the courage of those who provided it was remarkable. However, the institutional structures that had protected the systematic abuse remained in place, making meaningful accountability impossible to achieve. In 1863, nearly 4 years after Patterson's exposé, the Civil War brought federal troops to Marlborough County. Among the documents seized from abandoned plantation houses were fragments of Delilah's coded arrangements that had been preserved by subsequent household staff who had learned elements of her system. These fragments provided additional confirmation of the network's existence and operations. Margaret Whitmore died in her home in February of 1862, reportedly from pneumonia. However, those familiar with Delilah's documentation system noted that the woman who had tormented so many had died alone, abandoned by the community that had once celebrated her charitable works. The fear and isolation she had imposed on others had ultimately become her own fate. The plantation house stood empty for several years after Mrs. Whitmore's death. Local residents reported strange sounds emanating from the building during quiet evenings, not supernatural manifestations, but the settling of old wood and the whisper of wind through rooms where terrible secrets had been systematically documented through the careful arrangement of everyday objects. In 1868, during Reconstruction, the property was purchased by a freedman named Samuel Hayes, no relation to Delilah, despite sharing her surname. Samuel discovered several items hidden within the walls during renovation. Small bundles of dried flowers arranged in specific patterns, pieces of paper with mathematical notations, and a wooden box containing what appeared to be a crude but systematic calendar, marked with symbols that corresponded to Delilah's coding system. These discoveries provided the final confirmation of the sophistication and extent of the documentation network that had operated in secret for years. The hidden materials represented a backup system that Delilah had created to preserve the most crucial evidence in case her primary arrangement method was discovered or disrupted. The wooden box also contained something else, a single piece of paper with words written in careful script. The message was brief but profound. Truth finds a way to survive even when those who speak it cannot. Or, that note, preserved in the archives of the Freedmen's Bureau, serves as the final testament to one of the most remarkable examples of resistance and documentation in American history. Delilah Hayes had not only survived her enslavement, but had created a legacy that would outlast both her tormentors and the system that had protected them. The truth she revealed through her seemingly simple arrangements had exposed a network of systematic evil that reached the highest levels of local society. Though legal justice was never achieved, the exposure had disrupted the conspiracy and prevented its continuation. More importantly, her methods had demonstrated that even under the most oppressive conditions, human intelligence and courage could find ways to document truth and preserve evidence for future generations. The code she created had been simple enough to maintain under constant surveillance, yet sophisticated enough to preserve years of detailed historical information. Her legacy lived on, not just in the specific revelations about the Marlborough County network, but in the proof that those who appeared powerless possessed remarkable agency and the determination to use it in service of justice. Today, historians continue to study the fragments of Delilah's system that have been preserved. Each new understanding of her methods reveals additional insights into the experiences of those whose voices were systematically excluded from official records. Her work stands as a monument to the human capacity for resistance and the power of truth to survive even the most determined efforts to suppress it. The beautiful enslaved woman, whose stupid trick had seemed like nothing more than an obsession with orderly arrangements, had actually created one of the most sophisticated systems of historical documentation and resistance in American history. Her legacy reminds us that truth, like the carefully arranged flowers she used to encode it, has a way of blooming even in the darkest places. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. That evil, no matter how carefully organized or how thoroughly protected by institutional power, cannot completely eliminate the human capacity to document truth, preserve evidence, and ensure that injustice eventually comes to light. The arrangements have long since been disturbed, the flowers have withered, and the books have been reshuffled. But the truth they encoded continues to echo through history. A testament to the remarkable courage and intelligence of a woman who found a way to make her voice heard across the centuries, speaking justice to power through the simple act of placing objects exactly where they needed to be.